Hello and welcome to the Astrology Hotline, where we answer your questions about your birth chart or about astrology in general. Today is Thursday, August 5th. My name is Tristan Paylor, and hosting with me today is Kyle Pierce.
Hello.
We have a special episode for you today. Our question comes from Porter, who wants to know what our thoughts are about the asteroids in astrology. And as it turns out, we have so many thoughts that we decided just to devote an entire episode to this particular question.
Yeah, before receiving this question, I had really been quite dismissive of the asteroids. Initially, in my initial studies of astrology, I did like what a lot of people do, is just I read, that's descriptions of my, my Juno sign or this or that. And, thought it was interesting. But then, once I got into more traditional forms of astrology, I really just kind of stopped paying attention to them altogether. But this question definitely prompted some research that surprisingly changed my perspective on them. Had a deep impact, if you will. That's a pun based on the movie Deep Impact, in which an asteroid hits the Earth.
I love it.
But yeah, how about you, Tristan? What was your experience with the asteroids before?
The Deep Impact reference is not lost on me, for what that's worth. Yeah, I'm in a similar boat. I was a little interested in them when I first got into astrology, and quickly, I don't know, I kind of thought they were noise. And then, in the last year or so, I've been really studying traditional astrology very deeply and, really focusing on the 7 visible planets. And in a way, I am glad that was my trajectory, because it's sort of starting with the basics and starting with the planets that have been part of the tradition for thousands of years, I think has been helpful for me in terms of conceptualizing how the asteroids are useful and what they mean and, what they add potentially to the tradition. And yeah, I wasn't expecting to have my world rocked by learning more about the asteroids, but here I am.
Yeah, samesies. No, I think it ends up being really helpful. I'm glad to be learning more about the asteroids now. Just I feel like I'm able to really pull apart maybe what an asteroid, like in my chart or someone else's chart, might be doing a little more. Knowing how to differentiate between, say, Ceres and the moon, right? But we'll get into that as we go along.
Yeah, I feel like I should say, as a full disclaimer for this episode, I am by no means an asteroid expert. Yeah. I, did a deep dive into researching them in the past week. And as many of us do, when we start researching things in astrology, we immediately reference them back to our own charts or the charts of our loved ones and people we know well. So, I'm not like there are astrologers who have studied the asteroids for decades and have experience looking at them in hundreds upon hundreds of client charts. There are, historians who know a ton about the mythology behind, the names of the asteroids, like the figures they represent. I am neither of those people. So I think, a lot of what I have to say is going to be grounded in my personal experience and, the story of my sort of introduction to the asteroids in the past week. Because I can't really speak from a place of authority on anything other than my personal experience.
I mean, ultimately, that ends up being what sells most people on anything astrology related. They see something in their own chart that really, really resonates, and
that's true.
holy cow, I got to know more about this. And it's basically been the last week of just really obsessively absorbing as much information as I can about asteroids.
Yeah, it's been intense.
Yeah, and maybe, after we go over them a bit, talk about how, we might individually use them in the future. I think they, definitely deserve recognition, and, they do something. They do stuff, I would say. But I would maybe treat them still differently than, the traditional planets.
That might be a good segue into just sort of talking broadly about what the asteroids are, what differentiates them from the traditional planets and other bodies in the solar system. And
Yeah.
I think you had a good sort of overview, Kyle, that you were describing to me.
Yeah. So to define asteroids, asteroids from an astrological standpoint include planetary bodies in the solar system, some of which can astronomically be categorized as asteroids, but also larger objects that at different times were categorized as planets, minor planets, and planetoids. Usually when people refer to asteroids in astrology, they're referring to basically all the planetary bodies that are not one of the 7 traditional planets: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, or one of the 3 outer planets: Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Objects like Chiron or Ceres or Vesta, Pallas, and Juno, for example. Eris seems to also get kind of lumped in with the asteroids, but it's technically, kind of categorized as a minor planet, similar to Pluto, and kind of part of a group of trans-Neptunian minor planets, because there's like a bunch of them that they're discovering all the time. You also get different categories among the asteroids in astrology, like Chiron, for example, is part of the family of planetary bodies called Centaurs, comprising a group of asteroids and planetoids that inhabit the region of the solar system beyond the orbit of Saturn. Is it between Saturn and Neptune? Am I thinking correctly?
They're wild. I mean, they're very appropriately named and categorized. The astronomers who are working on these things were definitely thinking symbolically when they named them. The Centaurs are asteroids that have unstable orbits that cross the orbits of one or more of the larger planets, typically between Saturn and Pluto.
Yeah. Okay. You really did most of the research on the Centaurs, so defer to you on that.
I mean, Wikipedia was my friend on this one.
Wikipedia is everybody's friend.
Donate to Wikipedia.
Yeah, actually, good Mercury remediation, by the way, for anybody interested. Donating to Wikipedia.
Yep.
I do so regularly.
The Centaurs have characteristics of both asteroids and comets, and the mythological centaurs are both horse and human. So
interesting.
There's a lot of symbolic resonance there.
Yeah.
And it's estimated that there are between 44,000 and more than 10 million centaurs in our solar system. So there is a rowdy crowd of celestial bodies hanging out around and past Saturn. Watch out.
Yeah, there's so much information floating around in my brain, but so if I say something inaccurate, begging of pardons. But I remember reading something about there being, was it, and counting like over 100,000 minor planets in the solar system, or things that you could classify as minor planets. But the Centaurs kind of represent one main body, or one main category of asteroids, and then there are those that inhabit the region of space between Mars and Jupiter, otherwise known as the asteroid belt. And these include asteroids like Ceres, Juno, Vesta, Pallas, and Hygeia, just to name a few more prominent ones. But there are like thousands of these bodies. and more are being discovered all the time.
And the just to give listeners an idea of sort of the time frame, um, the first few asteroids that were discovered in the asteroid belt were discovered in the early 1800s. Ceres was the first. She was discovered in January of 1801. And then the Centaurs, being farther away, are a more recent discovery. I think
1970s, right?
Well, the very first one was discovered in 1920, but the Wikipedia article describes it as they were not recognized as a distinct population until the discovery of Chiron in 1977. So I'm going to infer from that that's about when the Centaurs became sort of a collective category of celestial objects. And then, you have like the ones that get used a lot in astrology were, I think, discovered from the 1970s on. Chiron was in 77, then Pholus and Nessus were in the early 90s. And Chariklo is the wife of Chiron, and she's come up on my radar more and more in the last couple of years as a body that is used by astrologers, and she was discovered in 1997. Yeah. So they're a little more recent. They've just come up on our radar, in very recent history.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a good maybe segue into just talking a little bit about kind of the history of how asteroids kind of started getting incorporated into astrology.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Well, I know that Demetra George was not necessarily the first to use asteroids in astrology, but she is really credited as being kind of primarily responsible for introducing and kind of popularizing the use of asteroids in modern astrology. She began work on them in the late 1960s or 1970s, eventually publishing a very popular book on them in the 1980s called Asteroid Goddesses. And her interpretation of the asteroids emphasized the mythology of the goddesses after which they were named, and presented them as representing a sort of counterbalance to the predominance of patriarchal archetypes in traditional astrology, as their discovery really seemed to coincide with kind of increasing awareness and prominence of women and women's issues in public life and society. And one thing I find very interesting about Demetra George's chart is she's a Leo rising, and she has Venus in Virgo ruling her 10th house. You think that Virgo often has to do with kind of focusing on smaller things, like, asteroids as compared to planets, and Venus being, very inclusive, sort of harmonizing planet. And the fact that, her career kind of claim to fame is really finding a place, even advocating for incorporating these otherwise minor bodies. And actually, initially she was met with like a lot of mainstream astrologers in the 70s just kind of scoffed at her, like, oh, we don't need these little floating balls of ice and rock, gunking up our perfect astrology.
They refer to them as like gravel or something like that. She does.
Yeah.
She's
floating balls of gravel.
Yeah. She's a guest on an episode of the astrology podcast, and she talks about the asteroids and like her, how she became interested in it and the reception she received from the astrology community. And I couldn't help smiling when I was listening to her talk about it, because, she was kind of talking about having to work from a grassroots level, because the people who, had the positions of authority in the astrology world were not interested in hearing about the asteroids and were very dismissive of them. But, people that she was doing client work with were actually really interested in them, and really resonating with their stories. I think in part because, there aren't a lot of goddesses among the planets that astrologers were using at the time. So sort of popularizing them from that grassroots place, And I kind of like that, as someone
Oh
who's
yeah,
got a little bit of an anti-establishment streak.
yeah, and I think that's a good for anybody out there that has maybe a planet that traditionally called in its fall or in its detriment, ruling an important house. Uh, there's a lot of ways that that can work out very favorably. I mean, she's one of the big, probably one of the best known astrologers in the astrology community. Definitely is going to have a legacy that is going to endure. I would assume.
Yeah, definitely. This is now a pro Venus and Virgo podcast.
Yeah, I like Venus and Virgo. Not.
I do love the planets in fall or detriment in the 10th house or in the first house and being, kind of movers and shakers who force the establishment to kind of change or criticize the establishment or just like, yeah, and even like from a Venusian level, it's not like she was criticizing the establishment necessarily, but just like her work actually relating to people did end up shaking up the establishment and kind of forcing them to wake up
Yeah,
and reassess their position on things.
like, oh yeah, this is what people want to hear now, and this is what they want to see at their. This is what they're asking about in their charts. We better read Demetra's book and learn about this.
And that's like, I mean, this is
I love it.
something, now that I'm walking down the path of being a professional astrologer, there's often a difference between what professional astrologers in the astrology community are really focused on and what clients who are seeking readings from professional astrologers are focused on. And the asteroids are really popular among people who are consumers
Mm-hmm.
of astrology readings. And I think, it's important to take that seriously. Like, there's a reason that people want to see certain things, there's a resonance there. And I don't think that we should ignore what resonates with people. Kind of defeats the whole
Yeah,
purpose of doing astrology.
I absolutely agree.
On that note, I think it is important to still sort of distinguish what role it is that asteroids play and what is it that differentiates them from the planets. I don't know if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, this is related. I do want to talk just a little bit about the concept of daimon. So Demetra framed the asteroids within the ancient Greek cosmology that astrology is based on as daimon. And daimon has a meaning akin to spirit in English, but was also used to kind of refer to the gods, but rather than maybe the personhood or personality of a given god, which might be called theos. Daimon was often used to describe the action or activity of the gods. And you can kind of get a sense of this when you look at the significations of the houses, of the 12 houses, with the bottom hemisphere. You get the house of good fortune, you get the house of bad fortune. And the bottom hemisphere houses are more embodied. They deal with topics that are more embodied, having to do with physical, more tangible experiences in general. What the upper hemisphere, houses 8 through 12, dealing more with kind of activity, more abstract, conceptual houses. The house of good spirit, the house of bad spirit. And then daimon would also describe sort of semi-divine beings that would act sort of go-betweens between the gods and sort of plane of human experience. I like to think of them as sort of like lieutenants, like the planets, the planetary gods give the orders and, they might give like a general decree, but it's kind of up to the lieutenants to decide on how it's carried out. And I think you can really see that play out for people in charts when you're kind of looking at their asteroid placements.
Yeah, I think as I, my beginner crash course on the asteroids this past week has been reading Asteroid Goddesses by Demetra George, and she talks about like a planetary matrix at points in the book where, like
Mm.
the moon sort of acts as a matrix or like an umbrella concept, and then an asteroid like Ceres exists under that umbrella as sort of a more specific expression of the lunar archetype.
Yeah, definitely. That's a very concise and succinct way of, of putting what I was trying to say. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Yeah, which I think it's useful because, one of the once you start adding objects into astrology, you potentially run into redundancy, which, is something
Mhm.
like one of the reasons I've been really kind of focusing on learning astrology and practicing astrology with just the 7 traditional planets is that, the meaning that's given to the outer planets, um, a lot of those significations were significations that already belonged in the tradition to the 7 traditional planets. Like
Mhm.
Pluto takes a lot of its significations from Mars, for example. So when you're dealing with just like a large number of bodies, there is that question of what do they stand for that isn't um, just repeating something that's already part of the tradition or already covered by the 7 traditional
Yeah.
planets. But I think there is a way in which the asteroids are like more specific manifestations of those broader archetypes, and um, they stand for specific stories. Like Ceres has a very clear narrative that the moon doesn't necessarily have because the moon is such a broad archetype. But then you look at the story of Demeter, who's the Greek equivalent of Ceres, and where the asteroid gets a lot of its meaning from, and that's like a very specific story and role that's sort of like in the lunar sphere, but you can like identify that narrative a little more exactly in a chart when you look at that asteroid. Hopefully I'm making
Yeah.
sense.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think that was really one of the things that confused me about the asteroids. Kind of looking at them early on is like, oh well, Juno was the goddess of marriage, right? Well, isn't that Venus? What is that? What makes that different from Venus? And I think what has maybe helped me understand what they're doing is like you said, they're um, it's like extensions of or more specific permutations of that theme. I don't think that Juno is like stealing significations from Venus. You could say that Juno is like another place to look for themes around marriage, but it also has more very specific themes around not just marriage, but um,
It's like a specific experience of marriage and a specific experience of
yeah,
relationship. There's a
or
certain,
partnership, yeah,
yeah.
that have that are primarily derived from the archetype, the goddess in question, the mythology around it, which is another maybe important distinguishing point about the asteroids is that the traditional planets, while a lot of the significations line up with mythology of the god that it was named after, we don't really rely as much on mythology to kind of pull the significations for the traditional planets. Um, they're much broader archetypes.
And I'm just thinking, the planets play these really sort of clear roles where, like Saturn and Mars negate things, Jupiter and Venus affirm things, and um, regardless of their mythology, they have to do a certain job within the system. And, the asteroids are not sort of tasked with the responsibilities that the traditional
Mm-hmm.
planets are. They just kind of stand alone as stories. And, I
Yeah.
think like when you're looking at the traditional planets in a chart, you're sort of looking at like, um, say a planet is ruling a certain house, and that says something about how the topics of that house might go in somebody's life. And a planet like Jupiter or Saturn having an influence on that planet is going to really significantly change how that planet like does its job. Like, say, a planet rules your seventh house, it's in charge of your relationships, and it's being opposed by Saturn, so it has to kind of work
Hmm.
against that energy in order to give you relationships.
Yeah.
Whereas the asteroids, when you're working with them, it's more about telling the story. Like, this is the story of Ceres. Does that story resonate with your own life story in a meaningful way?
Yeah. Yeah. I would say, especially given that, at least as far as I can tell, and the way that the asteroids are used, they don't rule houses like the planets do. So they're not creating scenes as much. They're not defining, the environment, setting the stage, but they're kind of like actors in a sense, operating within a paradigm.
Yeah. Yeah, they don't have that responsibility. They're kind of like they're not in charge of anything,
Yeah.
but they're just like involved.
Hmm. Yeah, but I mean, they also, in some ways, they show up almost more visibly, um, in a sense, because if you have, say, Saturn in your 10th house, in a night chart, you might have, uh, you may meet a lot of obstacles or run into really strict authority figures in, your work in public career life, right? But if Saturn is conjunct, say, really any one of these asteroids, it might take on, you might run into a lot of like powerful female figures, or, Saturn might be delivering its significations sort of through the themes of that asteroid. Does that make sense?
I actually really like that. Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. Where the Saturn that you meet in your 10th house is a slightly different face of Saturn if there's an asteroid right there, where Saturn sort of broadly represents maybe authority figures, and if Saturn is conjunct an asteroid like, say, Pallas, who is a warrior goddess, those authority figures might be strategists or powerful women or whatever the case may be. They're still going to be Saturnian, but it's Saturn
Hmm.
expressing itself through um, a more specific archetype.
Yeah. And, at least as far as I can tell at this point, further research may reveal a different story, but I don't know if like Ceres can like bonify a planet or maltreat a planet. I don't know if you can really strictly call any of them benefics or malefics or anything like that. I don't know if they have those kinds of powers, at least as far as I can tell.
Should we maybe introduce, listeners to the goddesses and the centaurs, at least, the ones that get used most often? So, we've been talking a little bit about them. Might be good to give them a formal introduction.
Yeah, absolutely. For most of my research purposes, just because there are thousands of asteroids, I focused a lot of my research on the big four, what Dimitri would call the big four. And that would be Ceres, Pallas, Pallas Athena, Vesta, and Juno.
Wait, should I also maybe introduce the centaurs just briefly?
Yeah.
We've focused our research on the four goddess asteroids, but I do want to mention some of the centaurs just briefly, just to give you, because they are used with some frequency. Chiron in particular,
Mhm.
Chiron is automatically placed in a chart if you cast a chart on astro.com. So most people who get into astrology are familiar with Chiron, so he probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but he is the wounded healer archetype. Um, I won't give, a whole overview of his mythology, but he's unusual among the centaurs in that the centaurs in Greek mythology are generally a very rowdy bunch of creatures. They're sort of feral, and they don't really care about morals or the laws of society. They sort of represent the wilderness, and Chiron is actually, he has some divine parentage, and he's not just sort of animalistic like the other centaurs. He's actually like a teacher and a healer. So he has kind of a significant position among the centaurs. And then another sort of similar centaur is Pholus, who does come up in discussions of centaurs in astrology sometimes. Pholus was also considered to be a little bit more civilized than the other centaurs, but he was not immortal. And then Chariclo was the wife of Chiron. In some accounts in Greek mythology, she is the daughter of Apollo. Unfortunately, I couldn't really find much about her that wasn't explicitly about her connections to men. Basically, all of the information I could find on Chariclo was about how she was related to men. She's the wife of Chiron. She's the nurse of a number of Greek heroes,
Weird,
including Achilles. And and her name, the one thing I could find out about her that didn't have to do with her relationships with men was the meaning of her name, which is graceful spinner.
Graceful spinner.
And then we have a lot of centaurs that are not such nice people. Chiron, Pholus, and Chariclo are, generally nice people. Then there's Nessus, who tried to have his way with the wife of Heracles, and Heracles killed him. And then the poisoned blood of Nessus eventually killed Heracles. So not a very pleasant story. And Ixion is another centaur that sometimes shows up in astrology, who, I don't know that he's strictly a centaur mythologically speaking. Astronomically speaking, that's the category he's in. Mythologically speaking, he's actually the ancestor of all the centaurs, and how he ended up as the ancestor to all the centaurs is also not a very nice story. So he's not a nice guy.
There's a lot of very not nice stories in Greek mythology.
They're they're not very pleasant. Ixion's story is not very pleasant. So, if you look that up, content warning for that one, there's a lot of bloodshed and just generally immoral behavior going on.
Yeah, I find, just on that note, is that it's almost kind of nice is that there is usually like a more family-friendly version of a Greek story, and then there's like the really awful dark version that, maybe depending on your tastes, you can sort of choose your own adventure on that to some degree.
Definitely. So then I guess, that brings us to the goddesses who we really want to dive into.
Yeah.
Right. We're starting with Ceres, right?
Yes. Ceres was the first asteroid discovered, and actually when it was discovered in 1801 by Giuseppe Piazzi, forgive me if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, Giuseppe, it was considered a planet. They classified it as a planet until about 1850s or so, when it was classified as an asteroid. And then I believe in 2006, the same time that Pluto was being demoted to a minor planet, Ceres got promoted to a minor planet. Ceres is what is called a protoplanet. It's basically I think it was like a planetary sort of Lego block that never really got quite incorporated into a Lego set. Ceres is the only minor planet in the inner solar system that's within the orbit of the asteroid belt. It's the largest object in the asteroid belt, makes up about 25% of its mass. Its orbit is 1,682 Earth days, or about 4.6 Earth years. NASA actually considers Ceres one of the solar system's primary candidates for the existence of potential life due to the abundance of water. In fact, they estimate that about 50% of the mass of Ceres could be water.
That is very fitting.
Yeah, that's why I want to get all this science business established, because it really does actually, same with a lot of the other asteroids, is that some of their astronomy and kind of physical characteristics really show up in the mythology and kind of how they seem to play out in charts. But also one of the physical qualities of Ceres, or perhaps the astronomical qualities of Ceres, is that under very rare conditions, when Ceres is at peak magnitude, if the sky on Earth happens to be dark enough, it is possible to see Ceres with the naked eye if you have just perfect 20/20 vision. But you can generally see Ceres with just simple binoculars. And I think that's true for, I'm not sure about Juno, but
It's definitely true for Vesta, because Vesta's very reflective.
Vesta's the brightest.
Yeah.
And I think that visibility is something in my mind that maybe upgrades them, maybe gives them a little more significance than some of the other asteroids, or at least, with my sort of cynical bent, I'm like, oh, well, maybe I'll take you seriously because, I could see you or something. I don't know.
Yeah, what is biggest and most obvious, and what do we give the most attention to? And I think, this is not strictly related to Ceres, but one thing that does really distinguish the asteroids from the 7 traditional planets is visibility and just the amount of time we've been observing them. And I think there's something symbolic there too. Like there's, by the time we started discovering these asteroids, it's because technology had advanced enough to enable us to discover, everything else going on in our solar neighborhood. Astrologers in ancient Greece or in medieval Europe, or wherever people were doing astrology, they didn't have access to a computer that would just like plug in where all of the dwarf planets and asteroids were in a given chart. They were calculating all this stuff by hand based on what they could actually like observe. So this is kind of a new era for astrology in a way that, the asteroids maybe symbolize is, what we can see, that whole issue of visibility, what is visible to us has expanded significantly.
Yeah. But what do you think? Should I go over the mythology first or go over significations first?
Let's dive into the mythology of Ceres.
Okay. So, just to give a brief overview of the mythology of Ceres, she was the goddess of fertility and agriculture, seen as the patron of farmers and common folk. She was somewhat unique among the pantheon for being just really actively involved in human affairs, as opposed to most of the gods who would kind of pick pet humans to take interest in, or, humans they wanted to have sex with, or kind of intervene when it served their agenda, maybe when they wanted to prove something to another god or whatever. There's a lot of games, the gods like to play, but Ceres is kind of the one that just did what her job was, just to sort of, she was really in charge of agriculture at its essence. But in the Greek and Roman era, people tended to worship the god that was most associated with their social status, their profession. So Ceres may have been perhaps the most widely worshipped because she was the goddess of the common farmer, the plebeians, right? You also get the word cereal from Ceres, from Ceres. Ceres was the mother of Persephone, maybe most notably in her story, who was kidnapped by Pluto. And there's kind of an interesting astronomical relationship with Jupiter that sort of coincides, because Pluto was sort of given the okay from Jupiter to kidnap Ceres, his sister's daughter, to take as a wife. And astronomically, scientists believe Jupiter's gravitational dominance of that region had something to do with why Ceres never formed into a planet. So in the story, Persephone Ceres goes looking for Persephone. Is it Ceres? She goes looking for Persephone, right? Does she go down into the underworld, or how does that take place?
Ceres, I don't believe, goes down into the underworld. When she finds out what happened, she essentially goes on strike.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
And nothing on Earth will grow. Because Ceres is the grain goddess and, the goddess of nurturing and agriculture and food. When she's grieving for her abducted daughter, nothing on Earth will grow and everyone is hungry.
Yeah, it basically just becomes winter, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so kind of to appease Ceres, because, she's an otherwise like benevolent god, but, if you take your daughter away, she'll mess you up, right? So the gods orchestrated a deal with Pluto, like, hey, Pluto, you need to give her Persephone back. But Pluto, was it that he fed or that he tricked Persephone into eating? It
was a pomegranate.
Eating a pomegranate, that's right, in the underworld. And the rule was that if you ate something in Hades, then you couldn't leave. But they, were sort of kind of got a workaround. Basically, you get a sort of a split custody agreement between Ceres and Pluto, in which Persephone spends, I don't think it was 50-50. I think it was... I
think it is. I think it's half the year.
Like that. Half the year, like 60%
half the year, Persephone is in the underworld, and half the year Persephone is in the world of mortals, and I guess maybe not the world of mortals. Persephone is not in the underworld and can be with her mother Ceres, and thus Ceres is happy and things grow on Earth during that half of the year, which is sort of a mythological...
It's like the origin of the
story
seasons.
Of the seasons, yeah. Mm-hmm. And there's this year where we can't grow anything and everything is cold because the goddess of agriculture is grieving because she wants to be with her daughter.
Yeah. So, kind of being the broad mythology, you can see where a lot of the significations of Ceres come from. So, significations for Ceres involve motherhood, nurturing. They called Ceres the Great Mother. She's referred to often as the Great Mother. Mother of the people. So you get themes of not just motherhood, but also not just motherhood in the sort of traditionally mothering component of parenthood, but kind of playing the mother role to larger groups. And Ceres is often associated with sort of creating or seeking out more inclusive, supportive communities. But you do get sort of darker themes with Ceres to do with kind of attachment. I mean, both positive and negative themes around attachment styles and also grief and loss of children, but sort of the natural grief that I think all parents go through, speaking as a parent, of just watching your children grow up and, your role as their parent diminishes over time and having to sort of let them go and be their own people. Hopefully not marry, the god of the underworld, but that seems to be a general theme that comes up. Is that something you have found with Ceres as well?
I mean, I'm not a parent, and I'm really glad you brought that up and that you have this perspective, because it's not part of my personal experience, but that does make a lot of sense to me. There's at some stage, a child is probably going to move out and they're going to develop independence. And how, as a parent, you handle that, I think, is a topic that is relevant to Ceres.
Well, it was a lot of the thinking around Ceres for me over the past week or so. It's been around, like not everybody's a parent. How can those themes play out or maybe show up for people in a much broader context? And I mean, you think about, with that consciousness in mind of a parent and their child, that they're eventually going to grow up and leave you and all that. So you want to prepare them for the outside world. You want to nurture them and make them their own solid people. And I find it interesting that Ceres is the daughter of Saturn. So you get, is it Saturn and Opus? Opes? It's like some ancient god about related to some ancient Earth god. I don't know. I'm not as well versed in the entire pantheon as I think you are, Tristan. But I don't know if you know anything about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure who exactly you're referring to. Oops. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
it's like
not sure.
OPPS. Yeah, and
Ops. Yeah, I'm not
doesn't matter.
familiar
It's
with
just the mother,
whoever
right?
that
No,
is.
I'm kidding.
I mean, that tells you something right there, right? Like how often we either haven't heard of the mother of a deity,
Mhm.
um, or what we do know of female deities. Like when I was talking about Chericlo, it's like the information I could find was just she's defined by how she relates to men.
Yeah,
There's no sort of like heroic story I could find about Chericlo. So I think that does tell you something.
makes me think of that. What's that poem like "Children of Saturn" or the whole idea of children of Saturn? Like there is some a woe and challenge built in to Ceres' story. I don't
Hmm.
know. There's a very Saturnian consciousness sort of involved in Ceres that
Yeah,
yeah. There's the sort of inevitable end to a certain phase or cycle.
yeah, the theme of cycles of time, and within any cycle, there is a period of decline. Um, and I mean, even the symbols for Saturn. I mean, all of the asteroid goddesses we're discussing are connected to Saturn in some way. Um, Ceres and Pallas is the only one who isn't a child of Saturn of the four. Pallas is a child of Jupiter, of Zeus. But all of the other three are actually children of Saturn and siblings of Zeus or Jupiter.
Yeah,
But Ceres is the one who actually has a glyph that looks very much like Saturn's glyph.
yeah.
The
Is the
glyph that's used
sickle
for,
like the?
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, the glyph that's used for Saturn in astrology looks like a sickle, and the glyph for Ceres is like almost the same glyph, but just flipped so that the blade of the sickle is facing up instead of down.
Yeah, and so I mean, I think that's a good like sort of hint at the way the other asteroids work. Is that kind of on its face, it sounds like sounds a lot like the moon. Typically, the moon is where you look for topics and themes related to parenting, how one is nurtured. Even one of the big significations of Ceres, food. I do find that the condition of the moon in a chart often does say a lot about food. But you can also see, themes of Saturn involved in Ceres and, even other archetypes perhaps. And that is the thing too, when you really like dig into astrology, is you see the overlap in kind of all of them, that there is overlap, that the way that the planets all work together create these sort of overlapping themes or themes that connect to each other. Like the moon and
Hmm.
Saturn, Cancer opposes Capricorn. So there's kind of an inherent inbuilt relationship between the moon and Saturn that, we don't always like to see the moon with Saturn, but the death and rebirth, the end of life, the beginning of life, uh, the shifting of seasons. But Ceres kind of holds that archetype or holds a representation of that sort of synthesis, if you will.
And I think something that I'm increasingly recognizing in my own study and practice of astrology is that there's a ton of overlap even between the seven traditional planets. And they don't fit as neatly into boxes as we would like them to. What sort of gives them clear roles in traditional astrology is that they're given responsibilities. And what you're responsible for isn't necessarily an indication of your total character. Um, so, like Mercury and Jupiter are sort of opposite archetypes, just as an example, but there's also a lot of overlap between those archetypes. But what it comes down to is not sort of like who they are as people or who they are as characters, but what job they're sort of given to do within the scheme
Hmm.
sets them in that polarity. But if, you were taking them just as characters in a drama, there is actually a ton of overlap between all of these figures. And so it makes sense that the asteroids are inevitably going to overlap quite a bit in terms of their symbolism with the planets.
Yeah. I mean, that's how,
And that's okay.
it shows up in people's lives too,
Yep.
There's no pure Saturns out there. There's no pure Venuses out there. Like they're all interacting. People aren't archetypes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think even the planets themselves, like Saturn was sitting here with us, he might just want to have a good time. Like maybe he wouldn't feel like being all serious and slow. Maybe he'd feel like, I don't know, going out and playing bumper cars or something, but he has a job. And when
Yeah.
he's doing his job, he's not doing bumper cars, you know?
Yeah. Well, that's and one of the other kind of significations of Ceres is the sort of duty behind taking care of not just a child, but a community, or your friends, or what other maybe area of life Ceres might be pointing to.
It's making me think too, as you were mentioning, the symbolism of Ceres as parent and her connection to experiences of parenthood. But, as you were learning about Ceres, you were thinking about the fact that not everybody is a parent, but everybody is a child. Everybody
Mm-hmm.
has an experience of caregiving when they are children. And I think that experience might also be relevant to the placement of Ceres in your chart. I think in Demetra's book, she talks a lot about the connection between food and parenting, and like your parents, how your parents, um, some of us have experiences where um, parents sort of use food or deny food as sort of reward or punishment, or, we learn certain things like um, you're only going to get dessert if you finish your whole meal. And we sort of learn from our parents to ignore what our bodies are telling us in favor of social norms around food. So that, I mean, that's also a lunar signification, like food and caregiving for sure. But it's interesting, like how Ceres kind of highlights that specific dynamic of how food overlaps with parenting, and how our experience of being fed and our parents' attitude around food affects not only how we eat as adults, but a lot of other things about our behavior potentially, or how we feel about the world or about ourselves.
Yeah, that's what I ran into a lot, as a lot of astrologers talking about eating disorders, with corresponding with a certain Ceres placements. But I just think it's making me think about in modern society, we kind of have the luxury of not having to be overly concerned with food. It's sort of, that hierarchy of needs, kind of layer of the hierarchy of needs is just sort of taken for granted. We sort of have it under control. But there's so much symbolically throughout history, even today, that goes with food. Having if you're going out on a date, you often go out to dinner. Business meetings are often dinner meetings. If somebody's visiting your house, there's sort of an implicit expectation to provide them with food. Maybe not as much nowadays, but traditionally. There's, a lot of there's a lot around that, but I don't find my go-to is not to look for food specifically when I look at Ceres, but a funny example I actually do have of a Ceres placement that maybe relates to an episode I did on my other podcast, Killer Cosmos, is that this may not belong on this podcast, but it's, John Wayne Gacy was known for, he murdered a lot of young men. A lot of parents lost children to John Wayne Gacy. He also, when he was in prison the first time, he was in prison for a brief stint before his kind of infamous murder spree, and he discovered a talent as a chef. He was like the prison's cook, and everybody was like, "Oh my God, you're amazing, Gacy." And that was actually what he did for a living for a while after getting out of prison. And he has Ceres conjunct Mercury in Pisces, like exactly conjunct Mercury in Pisces, which, if you listen to that episode, you can get more comprehensive analysis of what's going on with Mercury. But, you get both the food element of Ceres with his placement, but also unfortunately, the kidnapping of children. Which, don't freak out about your Ceres placement, people. I wouldn't start jumping to conclusions about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the trouble, right? Is often the most extreme examples serve as the clearest illustrations, but for the average person, that's not how Ceres is going to look.
Yeah.
To offer a somewhat lighter example of Ceres in a natal chart, my dog has Ceres conjunct his moon, also in Pisces. And I remember my partner and I learning about the whole theory of love languages. And we decided, just for fun, there's a website where you can do a test to figure out what is your love language. And we were like, let's do one for Kitsu. Kitsu is the dog. Mm-hmm. And so we did the love language test as if we were Kitsu responding to the questions, and discovered that his love language is definitely receiving gifts. But of course, if you're a dog, all of your gifts are food. And we know, toys. Animals love us because we feed them. I guess chew toys would be one, but he's really about the food. And, it's not unusual for animals to be all about food, but he's one of those dogs that's particularly food motivated. If he thinks there's even a slight chance that there might be food, he does not want you to touch him. He does not want you to talk to him. He's like, show me the money. I know there's peanut butter somewhere. Give me the peanut butter. Don't talk to me until it's in front of me.
Yeah.
So it's interesting actually, because I had to, sometimes there are funny ways that we project onto our pets. And there have been times where I've been like, you don't really love me. You're just using me for food. Because the way I experience love and nurturing is more through touch or being spoken to. And the way he experiences nurturing is through being fed, which is not as big of a thing for me. So I had to kind of, take a step back and realize his way of receiving love is through his stomach. And that's a totally valid way of feeling loved and appreciated and safe and nurtured. And it's different from how I experience love and feeling safe and nurtured, but that, doesn't make his way any less valid or important. Doesn't mean he's just using me for food. It's there's a connection, I think, with Ceres conjunct the moon, and the moon being about how we feel safe. I think it's not just about him, needing his appetite to be satisfied. It's that if people are feeding him, he knows that he's safe. He knows that we love him. It's an assurance that we love him. It's not just a hedonistic thing. I think it's a very lunar drive in his case.
Yeah. Well, it's like a baby, right? It's funny because it's funny you even said just a bit about would you even love me if I wasn't giving you food right now? I remember having that sort of thought from time to time. More jokingly or ironically, with my son when he was a baby, that so much of the bonding really though that goes on between you and a baby is the feeding process. My happiest memories are waking up in the middle of the night to feed my son, and sitting in a rocking chair. And those are the moments that when I think about them, I feel so much more connected to him. Something I have to do sometimes when when you inevitably lose that connection from time to time, which is just inevitable as a parent.
Man, there's a broader sense too, in which, it's easy to feel we live in an impersonal universe that does not care about us. I mean, it may very well be objectively true, but when we are being fed and nourished by the world, it makes us feel like we live in a universe that actually cares about us. So in that broader sense, like Ceres as, the goddess of agriculture and the food that we get from the earth, there's a sense where, when the earth is providing food for us, we feel like the world is safe. We feel like the world cares about us. So thank you to Kitsu for teaching me that lesson. Because I think, and maybe it's part of what you were saying earlier too, that both of us living in North America, when being privileged in the ways that we are privileged, food is something we can easily take for granted, and so I make the connection more between food and money than I do between food and love. And so that was like, when I saw myself reacting to my sweet innocent dog being like, "Do you really love me?" I had to be like, "Okay, come on." Like he doesn't have any concept of money or like material things. This is very much connected to love and bonding for him. And maybe there's a bit of a disconnect between food and bonding for me because I for one take it for granted, and for another associate it with just like it's another bill I have to pay.
Yeah, I almost find ironically that like food for me ends up being something that I end up being really cheap on or sometimes. Not all the time, but that I can be a little frivolous with my spending in other ways. Maybe food is not the first place I look to feel nourished, which maybe, resonates a little bit with my personal placement with Ceres. The one that Tristan and I actually happen to share is Ceres in Pisces, actually pretty close to the midheaven. And when I think about that, I think about like what makes me feel nourished or something. What it's like, what do I feed off of? In a sense, like it's like I meaning. When things when something gives, I can find meaning in something or find. Don't want to overuse the word spiritual. It's almost like the Pisces go-to word, but I find something that resonates in my soul, if you will, like that. It's like, oh, I want that. I want more of that. Give me all of that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So I have Ceres and Pisces on my midheaven, like Kyle does, and I actually did work in food service for most of my adult life. I worked in food service from the age of 18 until I was in my late 20s. So I spent over a decade working in food service. I didn't like it.
Yeah.
So, and I see Ceres on my midheaven, I'm not like, oh, I'm happy about that.
Yeah. Is there another way that
particular, yeah, like it's relevant, but I don't want it to be relevant like that because that wasn't a fun time. Not saying that it can't be. There are people who work in that field who are having a great time, but it was not for me. But that's certainly a signification. But I think it's interesting. It's in the ninth house. Both of us have the midheaven in the ninth house, and we're both astrologers. And there is a way in which astrology is a service of giving care and nurturing, but more in a watery sense. Like it's more about spiritual and emotional nurturing as opposed to the physical, tangible, cooking someone a meal. I'd think, Ceres in Pisces in the ninth house might have more to do with, helping somebody figure out their existential crisis, or, listening to them when they're having problems and just being a supportive, sort of shoulder for them on an emotional level.
Yeah.
Helping someone, sort out, a spiritual crisis that they might be having, that kind of thing. And I worked in the church for a long time too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it just for me, I did massage for a long time, about 10 years. which is another way of taking care of people, right? 'Cause I do, when you think about what seems kind of obvious to me now, maybe I wouldn't have thought of when looking at Ceres before, like, oh, food, what? But that sort of community orientation, or wanting to, create a safe environment. What are Tristan and I doing right now? We're creating a podcast that I think in part is an expression or part of an effort to want to kind of create a safe and supportive community around astrology, find other like-minded people.
And we both have Jupiter in the 11th house in our charts, and Ceres in Pisces is ruled by Jupiter. So she's in the 9th house, but she's being ruled by a planet that's in the 11th house. And there's that connection between spirituality and building community. And Ceres is about nurturing and providing care and support. So I think it all fits together nicely. I think something significant that really sold Kyle and I on the significance of the asteroids, at least, Ceres in particular, is that the way Kyle and I met is he made a post on an astrology subreddit asking if people wanted free readings. And within 2 minutes of him making that post, I just happened to be scrolling Reddit at the time. So within 2 minutes, I responded. And we have the chart for when he posted this, which is how we, started corresponding in the first place. And at the time he posted it, Ceres was in Pisces, and Kyle was having a Ceres return. And Ceres happened to be in the 11th house. So I had my Ceres return, sort of exactly a little bit before that, but it was like pretty much exactly on your Ceres, Kyle, when you posted that. And I think inevitably what happened is we recorded a podcast episode entirely about the asteroids. So clearly Ceres was like, I need to get my name out there. So I'm going to get these two astrologers together and convince them that they should spend, half an hour discussing me on a podcast.
Yeah. We were both having 9th house years as well. So that sign was activated. While there are like other transits you could point to is maybe being significant, that one's like the most exact and the most obvious. Just found that pretty interesting and convincing.
Yeah, that was pretty uncanny. And it's just, both of us being in a year where the midheaven is activated and both of us trying to start up an astrology career. It's very funny. It does feel very fated when you see that in a chart. There's, I'm also looking at the chart for the discovery of Ceres, which is really fun.
Nice.
Interestingly, both Jupiter and Saturn are in the 1st house in the chart of Ceres' discovery. Jupiter, of course, being a brother to Ceres, and Saturn being the father of Ceres. So it's kind of cool that both of those planets are quite prominent. They're in the 1st house in Leo. Ceres herself is actually conjunct the midheaven in her own discovery chart. In the sign of Taurus, which seems like a very appropriate Ceres sign. As Ceres having so much lunar symbolism, it's kind of fitting that, she would be in the sign of the moon's exaltation when she decided to show up on our radar for the first time. And Pluto is also in the 8th house in the chart of Ceres' discovery, which I think is kind of interesting given that there is, a significant part of Ceres mythology has to do with the underworld, and Pluto is kind of the main adversary in Ceres' most well-known mythological tale. And, he's right there in the 8th house, which is about the underworld.
Yeah. Is there an aspect, I think, with Ceres at all?
Pluto is overcoming Ceres via a sextile. So
Hmm.
not a bad aspect. Pluto in Ceres' discovery chart is in Pisces in the eighth house,
And they ended up
and
cooperating.
Ceres is in Taurus in the 10th. Yeah, so it's not a tense relationship necessarily, although Pluto does hold some power in it.
Yeah.
And Ceres was actually also retrograde during her discovery.
Oh, interesting. Um, Unless there's like other significations we want to talk about, I have just a couple like my weird kooky tinfoil hat ideas maybe about Ceres.
Those
Um,
are my favorite
yeah.
ideas. Please share.
Well, I would be interested to study the relationship between Pluto and Ceres in maybe charts that
Mm-hmm.
the charts of people who maybe lived those themes out, very visibly, and it'd be nice to sort of think of the degree to which Pluto can be considered malefic, right? It's not everybody's favorite planet. I wouldn't strictly call it a malefic, but to whatever degree you could describe Pluto that way, I'd like to think of Ceres as like a benefic. Maybe. Obviously it's hard to. Um, I don't know. Do you feel like a lot of the new bodies that we're bringing in don't? They're not happy bodies. They're not happy. They're not bringing in happy topics. We could use a little more, use some more benefics uh, in
Mm-hmm.
astrology. But yeah, I don't know that the fact that Ceres got kind of promoted as Pluto was being demoted, and that they are actually very similar size. That Ceres kind of has this special status, in the asteroid belt, and Pluto gets this sort of special status in the Kuiper belt, as sort of bodies of significance. Um,
Yeah, I almost don't ever want to look at either one in a chart without the other.
yeah, and I think that series of all of them. I think if there was going to be a takeaway, that just from an astrological or astronomical perspective, like it warrants bringing in it to at least be considered an equal weight to Pluto. I don't think it's been studied as thoroughly as Pluto, and weirdly hasn't been taken as seriously as Pluto, even though we discovered Ceres over 100 years before Pluto.
Oh, yeah, Pluto is very recent.
Yeah, we were like all over Pluto when we discovered
Well,
it,
and it's
and
interesting because Ceres was, I mean, I think it probably has to do with the climate around astrology. I don't think in the early 1800s that there was much of like astrology kind of fell out of favor between the Renaissance
yeah,
and
the
like
Victorian age. Yeah, it was,
yeah, like it really started picking up again, I guess, in like the 1930s. Um, so I wonder if, the discovery of Sirius just kind of fell in that fallow period for astrology. I'd need to look into that more to verify that that's the case, but I wonder if that's what's going on there. Because Sirius was declared a planet, I believe, when she was first discovered.
yeah, but
Um,
what makes sense is that it was in the 1850s that Ceres was demoted to an asteroid, and even though they're very similar bodies, I think Pluto has a lot more mass overall. But during that period, from the 1850s to 2006, was considered an asteroid. I mean, it was only really in like the 1960s or so that people started kind of using the asteroids in astrology.
mhm.
Maybe just kind of by virtue of its designation or label, like it didn't get treated the same way as Pluto.
Yeah, and it's hard not to see the symbolism that Dimitra George was really trying to make the astrology community aware of by talking about the asteroids. That um, there's when things become culturally relevant or become popular, that's a sign that something is in the sort of popular consciousness that's important to look at. And when you have these goddess figures starting to become important in astrology, we're in the business of reading signs, and that is possibly a sign of, those topics really entering the public consciousness in a meaningful way. Um, So it's almost like, the topics of it's very, there's a lot of gender stuff with the asteroids too,
Hmm.
because maleness is the default. Um, the fact that the asteroids are goddesses, um, kind of makes them sort of unique because they stand in contrast to the default. The maleness of the traditional planets, um, isn't, like as prominent a part of their symbolism, but the gender of the asteroids is discussed a lot as being relevant to their symbolism, and sort of, um, the asteroids becoming important, during, women's liberation, and now, we've had like Pluto demoted and Ceres promoted, in astronomical terms, and public awareness around issues of gender is, changing and evolving, and um, non-binary people are becoming more and more visible. Um, like, yeah, I guess there's just it's interesting that astronomically did seem to coincide with a change of priorities or change of visibility, I guess is the best way to put it, in our culture, where, Ceres, who had been kind of ignored, because she's the incorrect gender and was just around at the incorrect time, is now becoming more and more relevant, and Pluto is becoming potentially a bit less relevant as the sort of patriarchal god.
That is actually, we could get way out there or way into the weeds, but the 1920s, that was a time that was really kind of when the women's liberation movement was picking up, like
Yeah.
women's suffrage, but also kind of faced like a bit of a backlash too. I do find it interesting that the asteroids, I mean, they were always there, but they sort of showed up, or we started paying more attention to them maybe when we needed sort of different bodies to project specific ideas or themes onto, like about parenthood, which sort of fell under the moon broadly, but maybe as collectively as a society, we needed to explore sort of other themes around that, more specific themes, kind of separately.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, even that could get into a whole another world of discussion, like why does astrology work? If anybody wants to ask that one,
Yeah, please
that
ask
could
us
be
that
a
question.
fun 5 hour
That
episode.
Yeah, that would be another special episode where we only focus on that topic, I think.
Yeah.
All right, so we have Juno up next. Juno was the third asteroid to be discovered. Um, she is named for the the highest goddess in the Roman pantheon, um, and the wife of Jupiter. So the equivalent of Hera in Greek mythology, the wife of Zeus. There isn't as much sort of fun astronomical stuff I discovered about Juno compared to what Kyle dug up about Ceres. Although one fun fact about Juno is that she is very reflective. So even though Juno is not the largest of the asteroids, she was discovered before a number of the larger ones because of this reflective property.
It's interesting. It makes sense kind of with being a planet about relationships and companionship, being very reflective.
Yeah, that actually does really fit, doesn't it?
Hmm.
Yeah, I shouldn't underestimate the symbolism of these little astronomical details.
Yeah, they all have little things that are like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, that does fit. Um, Juno, I mean, it's probably more. I'm more familiar with the Greek mythology, with the mythology of Hera. I don't have any particular stories memorized to tell, but a predominant theme in Hera's myths is her relationship with Zeus, and how rocky that relationship is, and yet she remains very committed and loyal to the relationship. I mean, Zeus is notoriously bad at monogamy, and Hera remains faithful and actually turns away potential suitors quite consistently, which does, I think, with Juno and Juno's significations having to do with marriage and relationship, there is that question of what makes Juno different from Venus, which represents marriage and relationship. And I think maybe one of the key significations that distinguishes Juno or makes Juno a little bit more specific is that quality of loyalty and
Devotion.
fidelity. Yeah, devotion. Venus indicates relationships and marriage, but doesn't necessarily indicate, like, where Venus is placed in your chart might say something about your relationship values or
Broadly.
yeah, or what your marriage is like. Whereas the story of Juno is very specific. Like, Venus could be potentially about any type of relationship or any type of marriage.
I believe Aphrodite had many lovers, right?
Yeah, Aphrodite was not faithful to her husband. And there's a bit of a contrast between Aphrodite and Hera when it comes to relationships, where Aphrodite, I don't think, wanted to be married and was not happy with her husband, and had numerous affairs, whereas Hera was like, ride or die.
Yeah.
I'm committed to this. I'm not going to fool around with other people. So that is sort of like a distinctive like subcategory of relationships, that I think Juno specifically represents. And so, in a birth chart, I think Juno potentially points to issues around loyalty in relationships and what we're willing to put up with in our relationships. Like, where is the boundary? Are we willing to put up with too much in order to remain like loyal to our partners? Juno was one where neither of us found as much sort of stuff going on in our own charts or the charts of people we knew where we were like, oh, that really stands out as like a Juno situation. I don't know. Maybe you've discovered something since we last spoke, Kyle, about Juno in a chart that stood out to you.
I think that, Juno, well, it's something I want listeners to bear in mind is that for all my astrological genius, I haven't had a lot of time to sit with all these archetypes, right? So I kind of want to, qualify these are kind of hot takes or not, fully cooked thoughts about Juno, but kind of relating to the idea that the asteroids sort of bringing some focus onto topics that are generally fall under the umbrella of other planets, like Juno, maybe with Venus and marriage, and sort of drawing attention to sort of the other side of that, or sort of the maybe directing it towards. Let me back up a little. So think of Hera, right? And the shit that she had to put up with, being married to Zeus, who's out sexing up the world, right? And it's actually, there's a really good show on Netflix called Blood of Zeus. It's like an anime.
Oh, I keep meaning to watch that.
It's really good. Yeah, you should totally watch it. And I mean, Hera's not depicted very kindly. She's not very nice in the show, but just thinking about like traditionally what was expected of women in marriage, to put up with your husband's shit and be happy about it, because that is, marriage is like, that's your goal. That's what you want. You want to be a good wife and get a good marriage. I feel like Juno sort of points out the qualities that go into devotion and commitment and what goes into marriages and long-term partnerships in general, which is a certain degree of putting up with people you love. Shit, I mean, you can't have a relationship without, I know there are qualities about me that, might get under people that I love skin sometimes, but they love me. So, they don't pay too much attention to it, or they brush over it, or, we get in spats about it every now and then. Like that's part of being committed to somebody, is accepting them for their flaws, their shortcomings. But kind of with the goddesses, sort of highlighting more of a feminine perspective on things. It's sort of I don't know exactly when Juno was discovered, but I do think about women's liberation and like did you ever watch Mad Men?
I
How
did not
all
watch
the
Mad Men.
oh yeah, it's a
I
good
do
one.
know that they dig into issues of gender in that particular world a lot in the show, but I've
Oh
never
yeah,
watched it.
yeah. There's a lot of successful hotshot men like going out and just sleeping with whoever they could while their wives stayed at home and did all the cooking and cleaning and put up with it. And eventually a lot of them didn't, And I think that those are topics that became really relevant and made, I think women in general started to be able to get into a position where they could make demands of husbands too, to a degree where it's just kind of accepted more now. Not wording that right, but I don't think most people, when they get married now, expect to have their wives, stay home and be barefoot and pregnant and, let them frolic around and do whatever they want. There's more of a reciprocity, mutual expectation. And I believe that is one of the things that Juno is supposed to signify is an emphasis on equal partnership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
I know for me, I have Juno opposing my moon very, very tightly. And I would say that is the element of Juno that I can identify with. It's an opposition, which maybe means some sort of conflict there, but it's actually something that I've always sought out, like almost to my detriment in some cases, where like I needed things to be so equal that I was sort of uncomfortable with any sort of imbalance. Maybe go too far in trying to correct it or something. I know you have Juno conjunct your Jupiter in your 11th house, right, Tristan?
Yeah, which is, I mean, I feel like that should be, it's interesting because Juno and Jupiter are the married couple and they're within 2 degrees of each other in my chart. So they're actually together in my chart. Yeah. And like widely opposing my moon, like they're pretty far apart, but there is a sign based opposition going on there. I don't know. I'm just thinking about my own attitude. Um, there's this sense too I mean it's hard, especially as, a modern reader, not to look at the stories of Zeus and Hera and just feel like this is a very dark archetype because
Mm-hmm.
it says so much about the subjugation of women in the institution of marriage. Um, and another sort of aspect of the Juno archetype is jealousy. Um, and there's a way in the mythology, in the stories of Zeus and Hera's marriage, Hera didn't really have any power. And the only power she did have was to attack the women that Zeus became involved with. And so there are a lot of stories of Hera getting sort of pissed off at Zeus's various consorts and giving them trouble because of, what was considered to be her jealousy. I think there's an interesting reflection in that of how um, women's needs in relationships have been characterized as an inconvenience to men, and that's, I mean, these stories too. I mean, it's also hard for me trying to find myself in these stories is also hard for me as a queer person because they are very heteronormative. Um, but I think, even beyond the issue of like relationships between women and men, these stories tell us something about power dynamics in relationships in general. Obviously, the dynamics between women and men look a certain way, but those are not the only two sort of categories of human in which that power imbalance shows itself. There's a power imbalance in certain relationships where Some people's needs are taken seriously, and some people's needs are seen as an inconvenience. And when people whose needs are seen as an inconvenience to the dominant group try to get those needs met, there are not usually like straightforward avenues for them to get those needs met. They can't just declare, I have these needs. Like, I need to be fulfilled in my marriage as much as you do. And it's your job to meet those needs. So you're kind of left with no other choice. It's like, Hera is not, um, Hera's not jealous. It's one of those, there's a way in which, we invalidate the needs and emotions of people that we treat like crap so that we can continue justifying how we treat them. And I think this is one of those cases where, what gets labeled as jealousy is actually like a cry for help in communication. Um, yeah, it's like it's really convenient, when we're treating somebody like crap and they've finally had enough, and there's such a power imbalance that the only way they can communicate is, through, like in the stories of Zeus and Hera accosts Zeus's lovers. There's no other avenue she has to communicate with Zeus that like this is not okay. Um, and instead of going, I need to look at my own behavior, it's really easy to just say, well, that's her problem and she's just being jealous and she's just being, crazy, which is another, another very problematic word that gets leveled at people in relationships all the time when they're just like trying to communicate their needs and it's inconvenient to their partner. So, oh, they're just crazy. Like they're irrational. Their emotions are getting the better of them.
Yeah, I've always seen that as one of the like big key components of male privilege is that kind of privilege to be dismissive of the the peculiarities and the particularities of women's issues.
Mm-hmm.
There is a bit of that diminutive like quality to it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously it gets very complicated, but I think that those are like really excellent points. And I think, you kind of see with Hera, even in that dynamic, that the power gap and power dynamic in that relationship is so deep set that, yeah, she can't really confront Zeus directly. And so, she has to go kind of alternative directions or builds up and she gets hysterical, right?
Yeah, another good keyword.
And Zeus is able to discredit and dismiss Hera as, that crazy, jealous goddess Hera.
Yeah, so I wonder if, in a chart, Juno can point to a desire for equality in relationships, like you were, saying with your own example, and perhaps point to, how how we experience power within relationships. And I think, the sort of emergence of Juno as an asteroid that deserves a place in astrology is, perhaps a sign that we're starting to question traditional relationships. Is, like Hera is sort of the model monogamist, and it's like, is monogamy working? And if it's not working, but it's still a valuable way of structuring our relationships, how do we get it to work in a way that's fulfilling for, the partners that are involved in a monogamous relationship?
Yeah, it should be a negotiation and is supposed to like a mandate that one party sort of declares over to the other one.
Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe relevant to these issues of questioning relationship structures and questioning at least what we think of as traditional models of relationships. I was non-monogamous. I was polyamorous for many years, and changed, I am no longer, polyamorous. I'm very happily monogamous now. But sort of going through a period of questioning monogamy and questioning monogamous relationships was very insightful for me. I mean, I don't know if I can connect this at all to Juno's placement in my own chart being, conjunct Jupiter.
I can.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing what you have
I
to
have
say
it.
about this. Yeah, and I'm also looking forward to us getting to Pallas and, Pallas's ability to notice patterns, because I feel like you are very skilled at that and you've got a prominent Pallas in your chart. But yeah, I mean, that period of questioning monogamy, ultimately I did decide monogamy was the correct relationship structure for me. But I went through a period of questioning it. And something that I learned during that period of questioning is that if people like polyamorous relationships are becoming increasingly visible. And, one of the sort of challenges of polyamory is that in order to do it successfully, it requires a lot of open communication and a lot of negotiating boundaries and expectations. But what's interesting to me about that is that, it's sort of we expect that non-monogamous relationships are going to require so much communication and negotiation, but we underestimate how much communication and negotiation is required to keep monogamous relationships functional.
Mm.
It's and there's a way, because monogamy is the default setting, there's a way that I think people get into relationships with an expectation of monogamy, and what monogamy means to the people in that relationship is never discussed, right? It's like, does monogamy mean that I don't hold hands with my friend, like a platonic hand holding?
Yeah.
Is that, is it okay for me to flirt with people online? Like, where do we draw the line? That is something that needs to be discussed and not just assumed. But because when something is the default, a lot of things are left up to assumptions and not communicated. And I don't think that either polyamory or monogamy is better than the other, but I think where monogamy often fails is that people rely on assumptions and don't communicate their expectations out of the gate, because we're sort of able to follow this default script for our relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not sort of like in our face all the time that, oh, we really need to think about this, or we really need to talk about our feelings on this. Whereas with polyamory, it's like, very, very clear that like, oh, we really need to talk about our feelings about this issue because there is no cultural script for us to follow. We're making things up as we go along.
I think I just heard a swish of, like the basket. I think you just nailed it. No, that's, I think exactly it. Because we don't have that cultural script, like you said. Like, we don't have, it's not implicit or implied anymore. Those things do need to be discussed. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that, that's kind of what, the asteroids in general, like, are splitting off these topics, these things that are relevant, that need to be kind of brought to our attention, sort of separated from kind of the idea of marriage and partnership in general. Because that whole idea has gotten a little, there's some problems in there that maybe we need to sort through. So we need something else to like reflect that on.
Yeah, it's like highlighting that specific issue. It's sort of putting a neon sign at, this subset of relationship issues that, is a sign that like, you guys really need to examine this.
Yeah. Yeah. And just thinking about you and your chart, it's actually something that I looked up because I remember now. Been so much, just been a blur of researching asteroids. I kind of forgot about it. but I remember you telling me that you met Keith. It was like at the very end of your 7th house year, right?
Yeah, the very tail end of my 7th house year, like 2 or 3 days before it ended.
Yeah, and I was kind of looking at the dates, and it wasn't perfect, but I imagine that the period building up to that, you haven't really gone into huge detail, but I imagine the period that preceded meeting Keith entailed a lot of reevaluating, getting some new ideas about how you want to proceed in relationships, which coincides with the Saturn return and 7th house and everything. But Uranus was also transiting it was in Taurus at the time. It just kind of gotten in there. I think, I don't know if I identified if it had gotten to Jupiter and Juno yet in your chart, but, you kind of undergoing what could be considered maybe a radical change in your relationship style around, Uranus transiting Juno could sort of tie in to that theme. Also having, Juno and Jupiter trine, the ruler of your seventh.
And pretty closely too.
Just given from what you said, it sounds like you have lived and done a lot of thinking about about the topics related to Juno. So
that's a good job. Kyle is a really good astrologer. I just want to take a moment to point that out to everyone who's thinking about getting an astrology reading, that you will get insights like this from this human. So do it. Get a reading from Kyle. Because yeah, that's exactly it.
Thank you for the plug, Tristan. You are at least an equally good astrologer. And I think the thing is that it's really hard to get those kinds of insights on yourself.
It's true.
Looking at your own chart, you can look at it all day. It's like cutting your own hair. You to really get a nice, good, clean cut. Like you need. Granted, I cut my own hair now ever since the pandemic, but and I do a pretty good job. But there's angles and spots that you can't see that other people can. Seeing a really, a reading with an excellent astrologer like Tristan will help you get that kind of insight. Or me too. I'm all right.
It is true. It's because I think we tend to we fixate on certain things and we tend to find what we're looking for, and that's when it really helps to have someone else's perspective. Because I would not have caught that, and that is like eerily accurate. Where it was a very radical change. I went from a polyamorous relationship and from only being in polyamorous relationships for almost a decade to deciding this isn't for me anymore. And the reasons, and this isn't a criticism of polyamory in general. I'm sure it works great for some people, but I think the reasons that I was were not the healthiest reasons. And I went through this long period of really examining what my reasons were for seeking that kind of relationship structure and whether or not my needs were being met within it. And the conclusion I came to is that my needs were not being met within that particular structure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it was a pretty drastic change. Thank you, Uranus and Juno, for helping me figure my shit out.
Yeah. Well, are we... I think that's all we have for Juno? Or
I actually have a really good chart example for a Juno placement. I have Katharine Hepburn's chart. Katharine Hepburn probably doesn't need any introduction, really. She was, I think she's won the most Oscars of any actress. She is like a classical Hollywood actress. Katharine Hepburn was born with Scorpio rising. Her ascendant was at 7 degrees of Scorpio, and her Juno was at 5 degrees of Scorpio and retrograde, which may or may not be relevant, but she was a very, very fiercely independent woman who married briefly, but described herself as not being such a great wife. And she was very famous for being in a relationship with actor Spencer Tracy, who was her co-star in 9 different films. And Spencer Tracy they were, I believe, both married when they met and started having their affair. And Spencer Tracy actually remained married to his wife, even while having the affair. They never separated. Katharine Hepburn never wanted a marriage with him. So there was no competition in that sense, I guess. something maybe unusual about this relationship for Catherine is that while she was generally so independent when it came to Tracy, she was very devoted. She actually spent several years taking care of him when his health started declining in the 60s. She took a 5 year break from her career, which was really unusual for her. And a lot of people, described her as being like very, um, like she changed when she was around Spencer Tracy. She just lit up around him and she'd say, like she would do anything for him. So it's just that when I think about Zeus and Hera in mythology, I think about, the constant affairs and this weird contrast between, Zeus's infidelity and Hera's devotion, like her almost single minded devotion. And I guess, maybe there's some of those themes kind of coming up there where there's like, an affair happening outside of a marriage, but there is also that theme of devotion.
Yeah. Uh, Actually, who was Aphrodite married to? It's slipping my mind.
Hephaestus, but I don't think she was happy with that marriage, and she had an affair famously with Ares that the gods shamed them for.
Yeah, they were kind of like obsessed with each other a little bit, actually, from what I can gather. It was, there's a lot of jealousy with Aphrodite, actually, which we'll get to with Pallas. Aphrodite was very jealous of Pallas and all the time that Pallas got to spend with Ares.
Do we want to move on to Pallas?
Yeah. So just a bit about... Hello, listeners. Kyle here. I imagine you've been so enraptured by Tristan and I's riveting and incisive commentary of the asteroids that you didn't even realize that we are rapidly approaching the 2-hour mark, and we've only finished discussing 2 of the promised 4 asteroids. Now you're probably thinking, wow, Tristan and Kyle, those guys are pretty hardcore. And you're right, we are hardcore. But we also care about you, listeners. And just like eating too much in one sitting can give you a bit of a tummy ache, taking in too much information can have similar effects on your mind. Which is why we would like to give you an opportunity to digest everything by breaking this episode into 2 more reasonably portioned but equally delicious courses. For the Augustus gloops out there listening on release day, you will find a second helping waiting for you tomorrow. But for the rest of you, you can continue on with Pallas and Vesta at your leisure by downloading side B of this episode. As always, if you have a question you'd like to hear answered on Astrology Hotline, shoot us an email at astrologyhotlinepod@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.